to have your image and voice recorded. So don't forget that microphone is at the back, and we'll perhaps just move it up here when it comes time for questions. Dave Malloy, by the way, is unable to be with us today because he's at research meetings out of the province, and he sends his regrets and said to us, go for it. So here's just a quick outline. We're going to talk about the major budget challenges that were circulated to the group on the 14th of November. Going to give you an overview of the major parameters on the revenue side and the expenditure side of the budget. Quick overview of enrollments and credit hours. And we're going to take you through a little bit of historical data that you may have seen before, but which really tell a very important story about the way that the budget model of the university has shifted over the last decade. There's going to be a slide that I think will strike a lot of you as very forcefully on the changing student demographic. We're going to give you a bit of information about current levels of undergraduate tuition, and we're going to come back to the question of graduate tuition at the next forum, because it's a particularly complicated one. The longest part of the presentation will be an overview on the requests that we've had from the faculties and operating units across the university. So what budget managers have said, this is what I need for 2019 and beyond, principally in new permanent positions, and it's quite revealing. And then just a quick wrap up of process and budget schedule and the next couple of budget fora. So this is what the budget managers saw. This letter, by the way, is up on the budget update page, as it is every year. Here are some of the challenges that we think need to occupy us as a campus community as we consult with you and as we consult with the Council Committee on Budget. How do we mitigate tuition and fee increases while paying for the annual increases in salary and benefits? And we'll have more to say about that, but that's now 75% of our total operating budget is what we pay our people at the university. And how do we pay those increases while mitigating tuition and fee increases? How do we drive new resources to areas of growth? And I'll just pick one out. If you look at our enrollment tables right now, science is experiencing a real growth. And I'd pick out within science, computer science in particular is just going through the roof. How do we ensure that the students in that program, to choose only one as an example, get the courses they need on time so that their progress toward graduation is not delayed? How do we drive resources to areas of high demand? Viana's already spoken for her support of increased support for teaching and learning. We also need to worry about the support units that are facing increased workloads because of things like regulatory and reporting requirements. How do we make sure that we do the proper reporting to government, to our federal funders and so on in a timely and accurate fashion when activity levels across the entire campus are growing? How do we give students better service? How do we give research support more? How do we support graduate students who are now about 15% of the campus headcount population? And finally, you'll see a pretty startling figure on one of these a little bit later on. How do we take care of the externally imposed cost increases? And we'll tell you a little bit more about the carbon tax. So Dave is going
Actually, if you can go back there, because
sure.
Carbon tax and things like that will come up later, but this is only one place where CCP shows up, so you might wonder what that is. Of course, another one of these externally imposed legislative changes. Good news is that Canada Pension Plan's building up, but it's at the expense of us individually, what we're contributing, and the university as a whole. So as an example, this year we have to contribute an extra $300,000 right off the top that goes into Canada Pension Plan payments. That builds to $3 million. So it's every year for the next, over a 10-year period, $3 million additional off the top of our base budget as a first bit of money that we have to find for, as an example, Canada Pension Plan. Some of the other things, because it won't show up, experiencing increased regulatory requirements. Just another interesting one. It seems like the environment and things, no matter what, I could pick any unit across campus, both academic and administrative, I think. I'll pick a research one just as an example. The CRC Secretariat, for instance, came up with a great initiative in terms of making fairer selections and things like that on searches and things, but they require now that every person sitting on a Canada Research or a search committee needs to have unconscious bias training. Great initiative. However, just an example of now, in this case HR, we asked to do that on our behalf, has to set up a course and training and things like that. Every person then has to sit through, if they want to be on or if we want to be eligible for any CRCs and things, and if you want to sit on the search committee, you have to go through this training. Those are examples of additional expenses that come up, and they're examples. We've got fire codes and carbon tax and all these other things, but there is more and more each year that just comes right off the top as required expenses and resource implications that way.
Yeah, maybe just to put that into context, that Steve mentioned the CPC, the $300K that starts out with in the next fiscal, that's equivalent to 3 new academic positions, 3 assistant professors right there.
Next 2 slides, Tom lets me do the good news one, and then he does the bad news one after that. So the good news one is, and it's only good news because a bunch of different things have happened to the positive. The very first one isn't necessarily a good news one. It's better than we had a couple years ago when we had a 7% cut. But in this one, we're trying to take and identify where are all the different sources of revenue. So the additional new money that's coming in that we can help apply to the future expenses. And Tom will do the future expense one next. So the first bit that we always look at is what is the government grant going to be? Forget exactly how Viad portrayed it, but something like, well, you're not going to be too upset, you're not going to be too happy, and things like that. That sounds pretty neutral. Well, that's what we're forecasting, a 0%. That's what we got last year. In fact, you'll see the chart over the last number of years. It'll be coming up here soon. But as a best guess, we're hoping to not get a cut. May well be there, but so projecting 0% for grant increase. That was the same as last year. The good news items, first of all, funding formula shift. Through all the good work across a variety of different things, the Saskatchewan University funding model, as you've heard before, takes and shifts the money between the 2 universities. Since there's only 2 universities, there's one pot of money. We've got this very sophisticated formula, lots of inputs that then says redistributes based on activity levels. And the good news, over the past couple of years, last year we had slightly more than $1 million, the same thing the year before. So we're forecasting the same sort of thing, an additional $1 million that'll come our way at the expense of U of S over in this budget cycle. Most of that is enrollments. We've had, as you've heard before about the funding model, it's based on a 1-year lag and then a 5-year average. So over the past 6 years, our growth rate has been significantly higher than U of S. They've finally caught on, by the way. They are starting to recruit like crazy. Before, they were pretty happy with the status quo. So we've got to be careful that in outlying years, we don't start getting the negative part of it. So we're projecting about $1 million. If it were just enrollment-based, we'd probably get a little bit more. But the one piece that we don't have yet, and we'll probably have this by the end of February, Brian, and that's the research inputs and things which tend to not go in our favor, or they haven't in the last couple of years, and so it should still end up, our best guess is $1 million to the positive. The other aspect is the next one, or the third one, $2.2 million to the positive, and that's the tuition experience from last year. So last year we built into the base budget a 1% growth. We actually experienced more from the combination of the enrollment increases and tuition increases. So that money then sits as a base budget increase in allocation that we can take and allocate this year. So $2.2 million based on increased tuition revenue, mainly from enrollments last year, and the ratio and the proportion of it was more international students in that growth, and so the number is even a little bit healthier, but $2.2 million. Related to that, then, is what do we forecast for the enrollment growth for this upcoming year? So we're forecasting 1%, might be a little bit conservative. Some of the early numbers show that we're exceeding that at this point. So as an example, $875,000 is what 1% increase in enrollment takes and generates. So we build that in, and it can be redistributed this year. The next one, we've got question marks. And that's where we're looking for lots of input in terms of what should the tuition increase be for the upcoming year. nationally, we're not doing too bad, but in the West, we're actually starting to get above many of our competitors. And so it's at risk of impacting enrollments and things, supply and demand. If we get the price point too high, either undergraduate or graduate, so that's where we're looking for input. One of the things that will come up in another slide is we'll have some details on undergraduate tuition and rates. Tom will speak to that. We're suggesting that in the next budget forum, perhaps talk even more about graduate. So good news, there's about $4.1 million.
Just a hair over 4.75
million that can be redistributed. Now the bad news.
So that's the good news. And just before we leave that slide, I want to pay a little bit of tribute to Brian, because Brian is the one who really does a lot of the work on the funding formula as part of the, what's it called, Brian? SCUF? The Saskatchewan
Standing Committee on University Funding.
There we go. And it's getting way down into the weeds of the respective budgets and the revenue figures and so on, and arguing on behalf of this university for a bigger share of the pie. And in recent years, we've done quite well there. But as Dave said, Saskatoon has now woken up, and they're saying, we're not going to sit back and let Regina recruit free of competition in areas where we have been recruiting very successfully. So let's say we start, again, with no tuition increase at this point, with about $4 million extra to spend next year. Our estimate of the salary and benefit increases for our existing faculty and staff complement, so this is no new positions on existing contracts with the existing complement, to pay those salary benefit cost increases, about $4.3 million. On a total salary and benefit bill for the institution of $165.6 million in the current year. So that's what we think we're going to have to pay. It's a pretty good estimate for things like CGIs, for things like merits, and so on and so forth, for all of our employee groups. Right? So that's QP, APT, out of scope, and certainly faculty. Inflationary costs. Everything's going up. The big one for us is that first hit on the carbon tax at $381,000. So again, that would be equivalent to 5 or 6 or 7 new APT positions gone to pay the carbon tax. And the estimate, Emmett, is it goes up within 3 years to about 800,000? 870 or so. So it's going to be a challenge for us. Space rentals. As activity levels increase, rentals for space for things like U of R Press and some of the research activities, SIPCERT and things like that, another $318K. Saskatoon's operations for nursing and social work.
Yeah, SIPCERT would be self-funding.
That's right. Insurance premium increases. The cost of insurance is going up, about $140K, and maintenance contracts for things like servers and various bits of equipment around campus. So we're estimating about $900,000 in inflationary operating costs. And then what we're going to take you through in a moment is an overview of the 60 new position requests that have been received in the current budget round. These are legitimate position requests from faculties and operating units across the university to cope with growth, higher workloads, and things like new regulatory retirements. Our estimate, and this is very loose right now because the actual hire will determine the actual salary level. We're guesstimating here, but it's pretty close, $4.613 million. So everything we had to play with on the previous slide, just to go back here for a moment, about $4.075 million is more than eaten up by the salary and benefit increases of our existing complement, doesn't take care of inflation, and doesn't take care of any new position requests. This is where we now start thinking about tuition strategies.
And I could add one thing we just didn't bother putting on this slide. We didn't actually have it calculated, I think, when we put the slides together, but all of the other asks, basically the discretionary base budget allocations in other areas, be it either contract services or other expenses, are another $3 million on top of that. So in total, we've got a series of asks that amount to about $12.6 million. And as we've seen, we've got about $4.1 million to take and play with. So a fair bit of a gap there.
So this is the final day of classes in the last term. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but if you look over on the right-hand column, the rightmost column, that's teaching activity or credit hours. And look at the changes we are seeing. Arts, after years of being flat or in decline, is suddenly seeing remarkable increase in teaching activity. Business admin is up 12%, and so on and so forth. Engineering, with the loss of the Saudi students, because the majority of the Saudis were in engineering, and also the going soft of the petroleum engineering program, has seen a huge decrease. Now, we don't spend a lot of time on year over year. We look at 5-year, 8-year, and 10-year enrollments, but there are some major shifts happening on our campus. Fortunately, in the bottom right corner, we're up 2.5% in that final day of last term.
The next two charts are the series of 7 or 8 year trend and things that show where some of the challenges are as well. This first chart, just a couple of simple figures, but it's mainly comparing what proportion of the operating budget comes from tuition versus what portion comes from the provincial grant. Those are our two real and only revenue sources. You sort of see the declining grant level from the government dropping from 60% just 7 years ago down to only 50%. That is on the backs of tuition in terms of the rates of tuition, which have gone up quite significantly over the past number of years, and that's why we think that there's a fair bit of pressure this year and some expectations and early comments that we're going to have to hold the line as best we can on tuition. So some of that's where the tough balance comes in, making those good investments to fill in that gap of the $12.6 million worth of needs versus making it affordable and accessible for students with a fair and competitive tuition rate.
So just to add, this is one of the biggest single elements in the shifts in the business model. And we need to have a campus conversation about the implications of an ever-increasing proportion of the operating budget coming out of the pockets of students and their parents, and how that drives our decision-making.
Next chart, and this one is cumulative, as it mentions, but just to take and sort of show 3 different areas. The government grant in light blue at the bottom. You can see since 2012, 2013, it did grow. Basically with the rate of inflation for the first few years, then a huge cut that came to the university, and then basically flat since then. And we're predicting another year of being flat, which means that government grant's been the same as it was since 2012. The black line just shows basic CPI, basic inflation, and then this is the part that we get hit on by government a fair bit, is where our salary increases are far higher than CPI. And so they point to us and say, well, that's your own choice at the university. You don't have a budget problem, you have a spending problem. And so over that period of time, salaries have increased 17%. You'll note that the line was pretty well, it looks perfectly straight to me for the first 4 years or so. I'm sure it's not quite straight, but then it tapers slightly in the past bit. As you know, during those periods of time, that's when there was 0% cost of living or inflationary increases. What we did have was still large increases that come out in the requirement to take and pay progression through the ranks or merit increases, etc., which progression through the ranks in a number of different areas or career growth increments often amount to, in some areas, they're more than 3% a year. So those are base allocations, and as such, still an increase even in a period where there was a 0% inflation. Dennis, you had a question?
I just want to understand.
Can you get the microphone? Or grab a microphone.
I just want to understand this graph a little better, because that's a 17.4. That's a 17.4% increase in, those are dollars basically to run the organization. Is that based upon a steady state number of people, or is that salary increase in response to additional activities, additional courses, and additional faculty?
That would be actually probably a combination of both, all of the different changes and things. That's our total spend on salaries in each of those years, a % change from year to year.
So what you're talking about is comparing apples and oranges right there.
Just a minute, I'll get Lamont to tell us what that number is.
The 17.4% is the salary rate increase, not total salary increases. So that's adding together all of the cost of living increases plus the rise to the rank and merit percentage increases year over year over year. So that doesn't take, that's the single dollar in 12, 13, the same number of people sort of thing, that's the rate of salaries going up.
So I think if we look at it...
So are the churn of people calculated into that figure?
If there was more people here, that rate would be higher.
But are the people who leave being taken out of it? Because that's part of the, okay, now I understand.
Maybe we could just add one thing too, that since mandatory retirement at 65 disappeared in 2007, more of our colleagues are choosing to work beyond that age, and so together with many Canadian universities, we're seeing a growing cluster of people at the very top end of the salary scale. In the old days, at 65, you had to retire. Your salary then went to perhaps 2 new appointments. If people choose to stay on, and many of them are doing a fantastic job, we need to pay them the salary rates that they are entitled to, which is resulting in a balloon at the top of the scale that's affecting this as well.
So just to finish off some comment on this slide, that gap and the difference between either one of those lines, but in particular if you just took the CPI line and the salaries, is often what we've talked about in other places of the sort of the structural deficit, like what gives us the challenge each year is that the difference between, even if the government grant increase matched CPI, we've got that structural challenge to take and make up the difference.
Okay. Yeah. Just the mic, Peter. Again, we're recording this for people off campus and in Saskatoon, so just be patient while the mic comes around.
The structural issue is clear.
Yeah.
Why does the government not understand it? It's going to be true of any organization with progression through the ranks.
I wouldn't want to answer on their behalf. I would speculate as a citizen that around the cabinet table, issues like health spending weigh far more heavily than education spending for them right now, with an aging population, increasing technologies, increasing drugs on the formulary, more and more adult onset diseases in Saskatchewan. The demographics on healthcare spending are really frightening. That would be my speculation, is where most of it's going.
Sure, and I'd say that we make that argument in things with government all the time in terms of trying to take an increase, and even as the two universities, even though we split the pie, our biggest arguments are to try and grow the pie in terms of making it bigger so that the allocations can come. We had a similar discussion at Council Committee on Budget yesterday, and one of the things that makes it feel even more painful is that the way that we do budgeting is that we in the center take and pay for all of those salary increases as a first allocation. Another way to do it would be to take and dole out all of that money in what they call envelope funding to each of the budget units themselves, and in essence make a 2.5% budget increase to every unit, and then that unit determines how they take and spend it. And then at least it feels like it's a budget increase rather than a reduction. But it will still, in the end, since 75% of our expenditures are salaries, it will still, even if it's distributed at the unit level, it will still end up going to salaries. But it would force the units to take and use the flexibility that they want if they want to spend it someplace other than salaries.
So what's U of S doing? Because they have the same pay scale as us, and a median salary $25,000 a year per person greater. So presumably their structural problem is much more severe than ours. How are they dealing with it?
I'd agree with that comment. I think their structural problem is far greater than ours. I think that they probably have, in some cases, other reserves. That's what government keeps on telling me. And if you've watched some of the budget allocations to them over the years, the government has tapped them by $20 million a year at a time over the past couple of years, in addition to, and that's their biggest arguments. When they sit around the table, and we have another one of these scuff meetings on Friday afternoon, I'm sure Brian and I will hear it again, in terms of they want to see that problem fixed. So not only are they going to lose another $1 million or more to us in the redistribution, but they're still asking, where's the other 40 million that we got lopped off the bottom of their allocation?
To that too, it's a great question. Saskatoon is much less sensitive to tuition revenues than we are. The proportion of their operating budget coming from tuition and fees is still below 30%, whereas you've seen for us it's 40%. They have more endowment income. They have a bigger endowment. They've got some properties and so on that are generating revenue that are flowing back into operating. So they have a bit of padding that we don't have. And they're also, not to get into this perpetual argument, they're also funded, even if you take out medicine, vet, dentistry, the high-cost programs, we argue they are funded on a per-student basis much better than we are, and we're continuing to make that argument. So, have I gone ahead? Yeah, here we go. This is, I think, a really telling story. Anybody who's been around the campus for the past decade sees the changes on campus. But if you look, the bottom line, domestic, is essentially our local population, Regina and 100 kilometers, plus some students from Canada outside of Saskatchewan. If you notice, there's not been a huge increase over that period. And for the first time, we're down a little bit this year, year over year, in domestics. As Vianne said, the high school leaving population in the Regina area is in decline right now. And will not, she said 2020, I believe it's actually 2022, that begins to pick up. And that all of those kids for whom the new suburban high schools were built, like Harbour Landing or elementary schools, will start coming out here, we hope, and not go elsewhere, in 2022. But without the growth that we've seen in visa students, principally from China, from Nigeria, once from Saudi Arabia, now from India, Pakistan, and countries like that, we would be in a very, very different position demographically and a very different position budgetarily. Just so we're all aware of what we're charging students in tuition. This is from the winter 19 term, the present term. A full load is 10 courses a year. And the high figure on each side, on the right side, is the business faculty. That's where the highest tuition is for undergraduates. The low is arts, where the lowest tuition is. So for a Regina undergraduate taking 10 courses, if she is in arts, she's paying $7,120. If she is in business, $8,485. For 4 years, the price of the degree is close to $40,000. I'm sorry, $34,000 in business. But look down at the full load international undergraduates. I certainly could not have dreamt as a student here that the day would arrive at the University of Regina for even a visa student that a 4-year degree would cost nearly $100,000 in tuition. But that's where we're at now. And we need to have a really serious conversation about tuition. We're budgeting in the current year close to $90 million on a total budget, Lamont, what is it, 225? 225. And it's essential to running the university and paying our faculty and staff. But at some point, as Dave has already alluded to, we're starting to pull ahead of our Western competitors, and we're going to start losing students to other schools because we're too expensive. So again, graduate tuition, which is a separate and very complex issue, we'll return to at the next forum. But that's just a skim of what students are actually paying the University of Regina for the education they receive here. Okay, just that slide.
So one of the things that this induces us is that we are paying more than most universities in terms of scholarships. Mm-hmm. We return from various funds, the operating budget, trust and endowment funds and research funds and so on, about 30% of that $90 million back to the students. Yeah. And it's in part because we need to provide that sort of funding to make it more affordable for those who particularly need some additional help to pay for those costs. So in a sense, we're buying the students back, but it's targeted to, hopefully, to those who, either on a merit basis or a need basis, most merit receiving that support.
Thanks for that, Brian. We are, I believe, third currently among the Canadian comprehensives in percentage of that revenue returned to students in scholarships and bursaries. That's not a bad thing.
Just to follow up on what Brian said, just for my understanding, like a lot of scholarships are coming from trust accounts that earn interest. Is that interest calculated as part of University of Regina revenue, or is that completely separate?
It stays in the endowed fund, and so every year, we don't change it very often, but every year we look at what the projected revenue stream is going to be, so to make sure that the endowment stays whole in terms of how much. Right now, we target 4% is all that we spend on. In our investment policy, we try and target more than that. Our history has been at 6% and plus, so that those endowments are always secure. We can go in and look at the endowments and sort of say, okay, now they're bigger, we can either increase because that's a fairly conservative with that gap. So at times it gives us the opportunity to go back in and look at it and see if we can give more, add another one out of that same endowed fund because it's rich enough now, or increase it as well. But it is protected. So the base is protected. We only spend the interest that's been gained on endowed scholarships.
Yes, thank you. So I guess what I'm really asking is if we say we give 30% back or whatever, is it part of that $225 million annual budget? Is that part of our budget calculation?
It's a mix of both. I think the total number would be, you're going to evolve the numbers, Brian?
Just off the top of my head, and I think that these data are a couple of years out of date. It's about $22 million 3 or 4 years ago, and roughly 40% came from the operating budget. Some of that was pass-through funds from government scholarship programs like the Saskatchewan Innovation and Opportunity Scholarship. Roughly 40% came from special purpose and trust funds, and about 20% came from research accounts. Now, more recently, that research number has declined both in absolute terms and as a percentage. I think it's down around 16%, so the other funds are making up some of that difference. But roughly those proportions, 40, 40, 20.
And this is something, knowing that that's a big part, an important part of the discussion and things like that, that's some of the things maybe we'll do some more research and bring some numbers and some charts on that for the next budget forum as well, and have a similar chart in terms of what the tuition is for graduate students, and we can add to that scholarship detail.
Great. So the next stage of the presentation, we're just going to take you through an overview of the position requests. Remember in slide number 3 or whatever it was, we identified about $4.6 million in new permanent position requests. And as David said earlier, on top of that, a lot of one-time funding requests. But here's what it looks like right now. And the numbers, again, on the right-hand column are estimates. The actual precise figure in a higher depends on the qualifications of the person and experience of the person. But these are sort of median figures, all right? So we're looking at requests for 8.5 new faculty positions. The 0.5 is a top-up of an existing half-time position in engineering. The little LI after the 0.5, after EAS, Engineering and Applied Science, means a lab instructor. So you'll see the detail if you want to go over this in detail once the presentations are up. But we're looking at about $925,000 in new faculty positions. About 101 for a designer to support the activities of CCE in delivering online courses, because our repertoire of online courses is growing every year, and so on. CTL positions, the Center for Teaching and Learning, estimated at 275. The testing center that we're all eagerly anticipating to take loads off individual faculty members and individual faculty offices, we're looking at 235,000 there. Requests from FGSR, JSGS, Science and Social Work for advisors, admin assistants, a practicum coordinator, about 519, and so on. Athletics, very much a student-focused part of our operations because it directly serves the student athletes on those teams. We're looking at an out-of-scope director request and a QP position. Total on the academic side and the academic operations is about $2.4 million.
We've got next two slides are support positions in both on the administrative side and on research side. So the administrative side first, and I couldn't possibly go through the 80 pages or so of the different things and give all of the good arguments and things. But just let me tell you that going through all of these different requests, 60 or so different positions, another $3 million worth of general asks, there's not one of those positions anywhere that isn't extremely well argued and really needed for a variety of different ways. Many different regulatory changes and things like that, demands put on by increasing enrollments and just plain activity levels, pent-up demand for years of cutbacks and things. And it seems like this year, and this was another observation by the Council Committee on Budget members again yesterday as well, is that just this year more than any other year, sort of a pent-up demand and almost a releasing. We see a list of demands far in excess of any of the other years. So it's going to be really, really challenging. I'll just mention one that isn't in my area. I'll mention student affairs as a good example. If we want to take and help out with the recruitment, take some easy picking, almost low-hanging fruit and things like that, then we've got to invest in that transfer credit unit and things like that to actually take and get students that are easier to get, students who want to take and make a transfer in terms of easy recruitment and things like that, and take and invest in that area. Similarly, to some of the other areas in terms of things like the human resources, I gave the example of just plain regulatory issues that the Canada Research Chair Secretariat requires. All of that extra work requires additional people. A really strange one this year, it sits in the facilities management side of it and things like that. The city decided that the National Fire Code published a number of years ago that this year they'll actually take and enforce it to the letter. And that letter says things like every fire detection device and things, of which we've got 10,000 around the campus, need to be inspected, recorded, and certified back to the office having jurisdiction every year. Otherwise, they'll come and close down our buildings and things. And so those regulatory requirements that incremental activities that we need to do in every one of these units, whether it be increased enrollment, increased inspection, increased recruitment activity, all necessary to take and keep the university going. So huge pent-up demands in a variety of areas. On the research side, a bunch of different, I'll call these opportunities, different places. So a couple just in terms of taking and building partnerships. We can take huge successes recently, $15 million recently for SIPCERT, $9 million for RCMP, lots of work obviously in post-traumatic stress, but lots in other areas of energy and things where, and health, like it's endless. Every bit of activity that we have on the research front has a possibility of being generated into something even bigger and better if we could help those principal investigators and researchers and things like that take and get to the right places to take and generate. So a variety of different asks on the research side to be able to take and seize on opportunities and generate new revenue. Every one of them, great arguments as well.
Just to go back and maybe clarify, people may be wondering why, for example, under human resources, there are 4 out-of-scope positions. Many people associate out-of-scope with very senior positions. Out-of-scope spans the range of QP and APT equivalents as well. And the reason those positions are out-of-scope is that they're handling confidential human resource information. They need to be out-of-scope. So it's not as if we're staffing up at kind of executive level. These are needed positions within a unit that has everybody or nearly everybody out of scope. And the library seems odd in the admin grid. That's because it's a non-academic position request. It's a request for a kind of a community outreach coordinator, which is tying in with external relations and fundraising. Oh, and as Vian mentioned, One of the things that we're thinking of emphasizing this year is fundraising, donor relations, alumni relations, and so on, hence a pretty large request from external relations this year.
Hey, actually, before you flip it back, Tom, one of the things I should mention, because it'd be great to get some input on, one of the things we're hearing is that there isn't a unit on campus that couldn't do more, better, faster if they didn't have better tools. And nowadays, the tool of the day is something related to software. So one of the pent-up demand areas is just simply getting assistance to take and either upgrade software, install new software, do different workflows, and then do the upgrades and installations and things like that that are necessary, to, whether it be web or web-based or other software and things. And so across the board, we're hearing from people saying, yeah, I need 5, 6, 7, 8 of these different upgrades that I'm waiting for. And so one of the things, a request in there from the IS on behalf of the community, not IS, is to provide support to help you take and generate or to implement software and systems and things like that that can help you do your job more efficiently and effectively. So again, lots of good demands.
So here's the summary. 4.6 million, rough estimate of the salary and benefit costs for those 60.35 and other top-up position requests in the current round. And over the next couple of weeks, the Council Committee on Budget will be going through all of those. The budget presentations by the managers take place this Thursday. It's going to be a long day on Thursday, and CCB members will be present at that, listening to the presentations and asking questions. And then CCB will be working, as they've done over the past couple of years, to rank the requests and provide us with that advice as we take their ranking into the Budget Advisors Group in preparation for a final budget. A couple of other things, and Dave and I are just maybe going to bounce back and forth on these. These are just a few examples. This is not a complete list, but just so you know, again, some of the very legitimate requests that are being made by units. We've already talked about the need really to focus on fundraising in a new way for this campus and alumni relations.
Just this next comment applies to anyone working up at the College Avenue campus that has used it. It's a completely new facility, absolutely incredible, but in terms of support requirements, it is light years different than both in terms of AV equipment or facilities and things. And so both the information services people and the FM people to be able to take and support a new facility where the activity levels are at least doubled, if not tripled, and the systems that are in there, for instance, wasn't any air conditioning, basically no heating, no controls, nothing up at College Avenue before, as we basically just occupied a 100-year-old building and at best had a window that opened or not. Now recognize that we've got to properly service it. So to be fair to all of the clients and tenants and people learning up at College Avenue campus, we have to start augmenting the services. So support all of that sophisticated AV equipment and all of the other systems that take and operate. So a bunch of things in those areas.
Yeah. And then just, again, I think everybody understands what's going on there. The position requests we detailed in the previous slides are all permanent base budgeted. We've also got all kinds of requests for term positions to help out short term in areas like payroll, mental health, and so on. KHS needs more support. Their enrollments are up about 25% over the last 6 years. They need more support for the delivery of their labs as the research program and the involvement of undergraduate students in research and kinesiology grows. The library needs help. I see a couple of colleagues from the library here. We're kind of holding our breath to see what the federal decision on copyright would be. A few years ago, we were paying about $180K a year to access copyright. That has dropped to very, very modest levels now as we wait for the outcome. But if the outcome goes against us and against the university community across the country, and we have a big bill for copyright to pay going forward, we're going to have to take that into account. Student affairs, we need to market better, and we need to recruit more, and we need to go to areas that we're not currently recruiting. Because we are graduating more students, Glennis's office is faced with the fact that convocation in its current format is just about at capacity. Pretty soon we're going to have to move in June to a 4th day of convocation with all of the implications for additional expense, for rental of the Connexus Center, and so on and so forth. And then UR International, always in need of additional support. Our total international tuition, graduate and undergraduate, is very close to 30 million of the 90 million. And our budget for operating URI is about 2.4, 2.5, 2.6 right now.
Good. So what kind of inputs and things like that do we take and help make the decisions and things like that? Well, these are some of the decision criteria that have come up with before. These are ones that have been discussed in a variety of different form. In fact, we've got budget principles that are published as part of the budget letter that in the first couple slides that we had there, you can look them up at any time. But the general themes are sort of reflected here. Obviously, linking back to the strategic plan. The main essence of our being, the recruitment and enrollment of students and things. Emphasis and things on research, scholarly activity, teaching. We've got to take and invest in all those areas. That's what we're here for. And of course, a renewed emphasis, Vianne's opening words reflect on the importance and things like that of the reflecting properly on the Indigenous history, and part of that is our commitment to take and recruit and retain highly qualified Indigenous professors and staff and things like that as well. So that, I think, is that the last slide? No.
A lot of small print here. The deck will be up on the budget update page within a couple of days, and you can read it on bigger print on your screen there. But I'll just pick out a couple of things that you want to watch for. As we said, the budget presentations are on the 31st, this Thursday, to CCB and the budget advisors. That's going to be a pretty full day. The next budget forum is scheduled for the 4th of March. And at that point, we want to talk about things like graduate tuition, but also the recommendations that we have received to that point from the Council Committee on Budget. If they've got to the point of ranking submissions, we will bring that to you and seek your input on that as well. The Board of Governors gets its reports on operating and capital on the 11th and 12th. And then the big day, the 20th of March, unless it changes, the provincial budget announcement. We get our budget letter that tells us exactly what our provincial operating allocation will be, and then we really swing into action because we know what that big number is going to be. Final advice from CCB comes at the end of April, and the board reviews and discusses the budget on week 1 of May. So that's just an overview of the next series of dates in the preparation of the 1920 budget. And there you go for the next two fora, the 4th of March and the 13th of May. And on the 13th of May, we'll take you through the budget allocations, as we've done in previous years, in painful detail, line by line, and answer any questions you have. So that concludes today's presentation. You can send any thoughts you have to that email address. And right now, we'd welcome any input, questions, reflections, thoughts you might have. If you could just wait again for the microphone to come around so that people from off campus on the recording can hear you. Jermaine.
Thank you. Very fine presentation. It reminds me of the last 3 years I've been here. Not a lot has changed in terms of the realities that you've presented in the budget. But what has changed is the reality that a lot of students face on a day-to-day basis, and that continues to change significantly. And I think a lot of times when I look around the room, I think that reality can be lost on most people in this room because they don't have that daily communication and contact or experience as a student. But it's grave, right? And I always want to remind us of how serious an issue it is, right? We have situations, or we know of situations, or myself know of situation as a student representative of, 8, 7 international students crashing together in a 1-2 bedroom apartment. That's a reality. We know of students having mental breakdown because of the stress associated with the fact that they can't find tuition for another semester. We know how grave those realities are. And I know there was a professor had mentioned, how is it that the government does not see this? And how is it that this is allowed to continue to happen? And I know you had said you weren't going to speak for the government, but you tried to give what you thought as an explanation, right? And it seems like a fairly credible, decent explanation. But when you look at a budget of over $15 billion, you have to be able to make better decisions than the government has been making. This is about the future prosperity of our province, right? We have to be better stewards of that. And right now, as I said, the reality is, whether you're a domestic or international student, you are struggling, right? And it's a growing number, and the reality is grave. As I said, it's definitely more grave for an international student, but it is still quite grave for domestic students. And when, as a student of the University of Regina, I'm driving down the street and I can hear announcements from the government of Alberta on the radio talking about them instituting a tuition freeze in their province for the last 4 years, going into 5 years now. Why would I, as a student coming out of high school in Saskatchewan, want to stay here? Why? It doesn't make any sense. The reality is the University of Calgary and the University of Alberta have a higher prestige than the University of Regina, and they also cost less than average. So why would I, as a student, want to stay here? I think we have to realize just how grave this is, and this conversation should be involving the entire province, because the future of this prosperity of this province is at stake, right? And so I'm trying to exercise as much restraint as possible in communicating the seriousness of what I see with students, right? And there's plenty of students that come through our offices, and a significant portion of the money that we collect to students, since I've been in that position, is now going directly back to assisting some of the most needy students. But we cannot keep that structure for much too long. And this is also impacting the quality of education that students are receiving, right? When you have students who are working 3, 4 jobs, or working 2 jobs, or working 20, 40 hours, even sometimes more than that, where are they going to find time to study? How do you expect these students to truly be equipped and prepared for the competitive world out there when they are hardly spending time to go over the information that they're being taught? This is not how learning occurs. And so we might be graduating more students in number, but are we graduating better quality students? I don't know. And sometimes I will have to say I don't think that is true. And so the government has to be held accountable for the amount of investment or lack of investment that it is making in post-secondary. And it is now reaching a crisis level, and this has to be examined more seriously, and not just superficially in terms of looking at the numbers, but looking at the real impacts that this was having on the next generation, and the high stress levels and debt levels that the future generation is going to carry in this province.
Thanks, Jermaine. I mean, I can't be more eloquent than you about that. One of the things that we consistently say is if you invest in education, you're investing, as you said, in the future. Healthcare is immediate. It tends to take care of very, pressing immediate needs. But it's so telling. I don't know what the figure is for last year into the current fiscal, probably 2 fiscals ago, the year-over-year increase in health spending in Saskatchewan, just the increase, was greater than the combined grants to the 2 universities. Healthcare in Saskatchewan, Stuart, about 5.56 billion now for a province of 1.2 almost million people. And the combined grants to the 2 universities is somewhere around 550 million. So I hear you, and we have those conversations. It's up to every member of the university community, just as you've done eloquently and respectfully, to engage public elected officials and say, you need to think about your decision making here. But I cannot be more eloquent than you. Dennis.
Tom, I asked about the survey earlier for a whole host of reasons, and some of the reasons are just its confusing data out there. We look at spending on faculty salaries at the University of Regina compared to spending on faculty science salaries in our comparative institutions, and we're about 5% down. So we're either employing far too few people or we're not paying them well, one of the two. But it becomes a confusing issue. And that contributes to the general malaise. But I think one thing that really contributes to the general malaise is the sense that the university reputation is tanking. And I think that comes from national surveys and a whole host of things. And so I'm struggling as a member of this community to understand what the path forward is to provide the quality that was discussed earlier by our much more eloquent speaker, because at some point, leaders need followers, and I think there has to be a reason why people are going to follow, because it sure isn't the pay, and I think there's some issues with working conditions. And I encourage you, when you talk about these budget things, that it's really depressing. So, tell us how it's not going to be managed, but tell us where we're going to go and how we're going to get there. And I know it's a big question, and I know I sprung it on you, but you got broad shoulders.
I wish I had a crystal ball. I will give you what, again, in my personal opinion, is one ray of hope, and that is we're heading into an election year soon in the province. I think that is an ideal time to redouble our arguments for investment in post-secondary in a province that desperately needs to retain highly qualified students and to attract people to live and work here, study here, and then live and work and pay taxes. That's the time to do that. With the demographics, with the population patterns in Saskatchewan, we're going to have to work really hard to make sure that we attract and retain sufficient numbers of people from outside the province to stay, live, and work and pay taxes in this province. And the universities are a major engine of that kind of economic growth and social capital advancement. As Peter will point out repeatedly too, we have not, as a province, and I would argue maybe even we, particularly as a university, have not articulated as well as we could the benefits to society, both in terms of monetary returns, but also in terms of social capital and prestige of investing more in the research enterprise, both undergraduate and graduate. There are a whole host of things that need to be done there. And at times the picture does look kind of bleak. When you come off that one grant, the grant line essentially now flat for 3 years, and you're saying, what can we do with costs going up every year? We can't continue to pack more students in and charge them more tuition just to pay the same number of people. So what we've done, I'll give you one example, is to try to drive some resources to areas of program innovation that have clearly attracted enrollments we wouldn't otherwise have had at this university. One example is the MHA, the Masters of Health Administration. We're launching a Master's in Health Information Management in the Computer Science Department in the Faculty of Science. When are we launching this fall?
Yeah, September.
There you have it from the Dean. These programs are designed to raise the institution's profile nationally with groups of students, often professional students, and bring in, again, much needed tuition revenue that actually helps cover the costs and eventually cover the full costs of those programs. The other thing we've been actually pretty successful at, and I'm quite proud of this because we have a lot of competition for highly skilled faculty, but we have made, the deans have made, the faculties have made some incredibly good hires in the past couple of years. And we have to fight very hard to retain those people here in Regina because they will contribute, I think, more than any of us to the building up of the institution and its reputation. At a risk of singling one person out, how many of you know the name Gord Pennicook? Anybody know that name? There you go. One person, because he's new.
No.
Two people, both in external relations. Three from the faculty where Gord works. I don't mean to single him out, but Gord is a recent hire who does some absolutely fascinating research on how people determine what news sources are trustworthy and which aren't. That sounds like an odd thing for a guy in business to do. He's actually, I think, a psychologist by training, but business has recruited him. His work has been published and reported on in the New York Times. I just saw something today in the Columbia Journalism Review, so we're trying to hook him up with our colleagues in journalism and political science and in public policy. That's a fantastic hire. And it's that kind of thing, despite our challenges on salaries and occasionally the weather, that we really need to focus on in attracting, retaining, and making sticky assets of really good people, whether they're faculty or staff or APT or QP. Do you want to add?
Sure. I'll answer the question in a completely different way. And as Dennis knows, I'm more glass half full guy than the empty part of the glass. It's tough to measure what you're asking us to measure in terms of morale and things. Everyone would have their own perspective. But if we were to measure, and sometimes I think internally we don't appreciate things as much, like how good things are internally. But if the measure of what the external community thinks of a job at the university is any measure, we've never been at a higher point. We've had lots and lots of competitions. In fact, it's overwhelming the HR team. And in every case, the length and depth and the quality of the applicant on any level is extreme. So the outside community thinks that a job at the university is absolutely incredible. And so they're voting with their feet. They're applying for jobs here. We're getting absolutely fantastic candidates, and we're getting lots of them. So I'd say things are pretty good. And I'd say a job at the university is pretty good. It's always hard when you're internal to take and maybe appreciate that, but our external people sure recognize it.
Can either of you tell me what fraction of the asks normally get filled? Because I find this very difficult to evaluate. Mm-hmm. I could ask you for 20 positions hoping to get one. And if I got the one that I really wanted, then the other 19 are irrelevant. I'm curious about the fraction of rollover. How many of these asks are last year's asks and the year before?
Last year we had a total, I think, of 27. Correct me if I'm wrong, 27 asks. And we were able to fill, say yes to 9. 2 of those were the CRC conversions. So net new, 7. Faculty positions, yeah. And then how many other non-faculty positions were we able to do? Not a heck of a lot.
And I'd say it's different. Every year we ask for something different. So some years, units were very happy to just say, please don't touch me. Don't give me anything. Don't take anything away. I'll be happy. And in fact, the scenarios we asked for in the budget submissions were give us scenarios of -5, -3, -1, etc. And so the asks in those years were minimal. And so it's definitely not an apples to apples comparison. But this year, in general terms, this is of the 12 years that I've been involved in doing it, this is probably the biggest set of asks ever in the last 12 budgets I've worked on.
So that'd be interesting to know that on a rolling average, because I was struck by 14% of all asks are faculty. A lot of faculty would be surprised that that number is that low. And maybe it's just low because this year's anomalously high in the other sectors. There was the admin sector in particular was high. And even some of the positions within the other position requests were more support than frontline troops, if you want. So coming back to the question of quality of education, you know, when you're plotting that line of saying, oh, look, we've gone up 17% in salaries, if only 14% of that is actually the people doing the teaching and research, then it's a slightly different optic than saying, oh, we're paid too much or whatever. Yeah. And this is going to roll into our discussions about, as you know, the contract renewal.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments?
350.
If there aren't any,
I was going to respond to Dennis's point about reputation, but he left. But I'll do it anyway just to fill up the time.
No, not just to fill up the time.
We need to remember that Maclean's is not in the business of conducting scientific research about the quality of education at various universities. It's about selling magazines. One year they actually published the same data as the previous year and simply repackaged the stories around it, and very small print said we haven't really changed the numbers. We did a survey a couple of years ago of guidance and career counselors in high schools in our principal catchment area, all of Saskatchewan, southwestern Manitoba, southern Alberta. And we asked them, do you participate in that Maclean's reputational survey? Because that's supposedly an important part of that reputational survey. Turned out very, very few of those counselors actually participated. Most of them said, we don't know enough about the comparative universities to make judgments like that, or we don't believe in doing something like that. We also asked them, particularly for the University of Regina, what's your view of the quality of the university compared to what Maclean said? And across the board, the counselors in Saskatchewan said, the University of Regina is better than Maclean's is telling us. I'm not really all that concerned about what Maclean's reports, other than the fact that people believe it. I'm much more interested in what our students tell us about the quality of their experiences on campus, both their educational and their co-curricular ones. And that's the information I think we should pay attention to.
Thank you, Brian. Peter.
Sorry, I'm not going to buy that at all. A lot of the metrics in the Maclean's are the same metrics that we use to evaluate research productivity. We have sunk through time, through the last 10 or 15 years. We are not performing as well as we used to. It shows up in our fraction of national funding. It shows up in our allocation of chairs. It shows up in our CFI allocation. It shows up in our undergraduate awards. So we have some work to do.
Thank you. You know, another thing that everybody, I think, worries about is the role of social media and how quickly a university's reputation can be damaged without trivializing this cockroach story. Regina is a very small media market. We have a fairly typical, for a big institution with food services and so on, incident. We disclose it. CBC has got this huge color picture of a very not friendly-looking cockroach waving its whatever at you. It will be in Academica's top 10 the next day if it hasn't already been there. We've got to come to terms with a social media environment that frequently, even with trivial things, cause people across the country to think, Regina again, cockroaches, what is it now? And I would argue that the University of Toronto, a very fine school, does not, because of the nature of the Toronto media market, get that kind of attention. I can assure you that Toronto will have cockroaches in some of those old buildings. But it's never national news. Regina, it is. Anyway, if there's nothing further on that rather pestiferous note, thank you so much for coming today. The recording and the slides will be up within a couple of days on the ORP website. And we invite you back for the next forum. Thank you very much for your input. And Dave? Did you want to say anything?
No, unless there's any other questions, thanks, and feel free to send us stuff in between. And if there's stuff you'd like to see in the next budget forum, let us know as well. We'll do some more on scholarship and grad and things like that for sure, in addition to what we would typically do anyway. Thanks very much.